I think we're live. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jenny and this is
I'm Malcolm.
And tonight we're going to talk about whole grains. It's something we eat. We eat whole grains wherever we can. And we were thinking about this recently in our local supermarket. Firstly, we generally shop at Coles, that's our nearest supermarket, and they have quite a nice whole grain pasta that is organic, but it's been missing from the shelf for weeks and weeks and weeks, and even to the point that I've asked one of the staff there and what's happening. It hasn't been deleted, but it just hasn't been there. And so we looked along the shelves to try and work out, well, okay, we can't buy our favourite one. What other whole grain pasta can we buy?
And this is quite a large area of floor
Like
to top
a
shelf
huge
space.
section of an aisle at a major supermarket. There were no other whole grain pasta products on the shelf. There was nothing else we could have bought. Zero. And that really, we just shook our head because people are obviously not eating whole grains. And
The rice section was more positive. They do have quite a few brown rice products there, but obviously people are not eating whole grain pasta.
And so the other thing that came to our attention came across an article in The Guardian, which I did actually post on our Facebook page just a short while ago. And I'll post the link again if anyone wants to read it. And you've read it a bit more thoroughly than me. You want to talk about it?
Yeah. In 2008, the Danish Whole Grain Partnership was established, a coalition of government, non-government health organisations like heart associations and things, and the food industry. This is 2008, and by 2019. Whole grain intake in Denmark had increased from an average of 36 grams a day to 82 grams a day. Compare this to some other countries like the Brits only eat about 20 per day. We're not even sure what Australians eat. I don't know if anyone knows, but
we do know that it's been decreasing. There was something on
there was a report. Consumption of
it's the percent of cereal grains in total that were whole has gone down from 34 to 31.5% just in the last couple
4
of years.
Yep. So the Danish Whole Grain Partnership recognises 9 different grains: wheat, spelt, barley, rice, both red and brown, rye, oats, millet, corn, and sorghum, and are thinking about adding the pseudo grains, amaranth, quinoa, and buckwheat. Products in Denmark, if they're whole grain, have this nice fancy orange whole grain logo on them. And the government supported this with their dietary guidelines. 2009, 4 serves of whole grains a day. 2013, more specific, 75 grams. The latest, 2024, 90 grams of whole grains a day recommended for everybody per day. And the partnerships, maybe it's something only the Danes can do when government and industry and everyone gets together, and has encouraged food producers to even add a little bit of whole grains to everything, even pastries, cakes, biscuits, burger buns. Consumers don't notice the difference and are generally quite supportive of the program. What else can the Danes do? In 2023, they launched their action plan for plant-based food, aiming at reducing meat consumption for environmental and health reasons. Be interesting to see how that goes. I can't imagine that happening in Australia.
Well, we did recently find, I think it was the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare website had said that meat consumption has actually risen in the last 5 years.
So what's happened with whole?
In Australia, that is, yeah.
And in the US.
And just also pause for those of you watching us live. We are streaming to both YouTube and Facebook, and we'll be able to see the comments stream. If you want to ask us any questions throughout our little talk, please do. Please, or even just say hi in the comments stream. And we did actually discover recently that the Facebook post after 30 days gets deleted. So I'm encouraging more people to watch us on YouTube, because if you comment there, then the comment stays. But the Facebook post disappears in a month. Anyway, on you go.
Yeah, what's happened to whole grains in Australia? I'm old enough to remember that, like back in the 80s and 90s, whole grains were a really big thing. Get healthy, eat whole grains. Whole grains seem to have, I think they've been smashed by the low carb movement. This movement, is sort of a bit anti-grain as well, and pays a little more than lip service to the healthy whole grains. I think we might consider another live stream just on the myths and lies of the low carb diet movement. Controversial. So the whole grain cause is not helped by all the nutrition articles that appear in our media, and most of these, are emphasizing, protein, good fats. And when grains are in there, and their whole grains are in there, like, yeah, these are really healthy as part of a healthy diet, but then they often add on, but only in certain amounts. Like, don't eat too many of them, whereas they don't usually put that message next to the fish or chicken, for example. So that's hardly a positive message, where you say these things are healthy, but don't eat too much of them. Legumes can be as high as 70% carbohydrate. So most legumes, other than soy and technically peanut, most of the other legumes are actually quite high carbohydrate, moderate protein, and can have a macro ratio of 70% carbs. But they sort of escape the low carb rhetoric, because I think no one really looks them up and realizes that they're predominantly carbohydrate. So the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which are currently under review, they have a grain sort of food group section that says grain foods, mostly whole grain and or high fibre cereal types, such as, and they list all the different kind of grains. Let's hope the next guidelines give stronger advice and more specific advice rather than just mostly whole grains. But I won't hold my bowels or my breath waiting for it to happen. Sorry about that, Jenny.
So why are we always talking about make it whole grains where you can?
First of all, we need to understand that sort of what a grain looks like when you sort of cross-section it. There's a husk on the outside, and it's generally inedible and removed. And then there's three layers. There's the bran, the outer layer, and then there's a big chunky inner layer, the endosperm, where most of the starch is. And then there's a little bit in the middle or somewhere, which is the germ. The bran and the germ have most of the nutrients, whereas the endosperm has most of the calories. So it can make a big difference to your nutrient intake, whether you choose a whole grain or a refined grain. We'll have a look at some nutrient groups. And whole grains, although they're all different grains, they sort of tend to follow a similar pattern with nutrient content. And the most important nutrient is dietary fibre. And grains are a rich source of all types of fibre, insoluble fibre, soluble fibre that the microbes can feed on, and something called resistant starch. This is the intact whole grains. They sort of help to ferry this resistant starch down to the colon, where the microbiome can work on it and produce things like short-chain fatty acids like butyrate that support gut health, gut barrier, and actually support health all over the body. And I've said intact, preferably intact. What do we mean by an intact grain? It's one that hasn't been ground up. Like, it might have been chopped into some little pieces. It might have been steamed and rolled like a rolled oat, but it essentially, retains its structure.
And its nutrients.
And its nutrients. Whereas, when you grind a grain up into a fine powder, like into a flour, it's a lot more quickly absorbed in the gut. And so, for people who have, insulin resistance, it can be a bit of a problem for rises in blood sugar, and most likely less sort of fibre delivered to the colon too, because of the disruption of the fibre. However, cohort studies, like studies of populations like British and Americans, still find that even though the whole grains predominantly whole grain bread, they still find it's associated with better health outcomes. Now, there's some questions here.
Oh, wait, well, that's about dietary fat, so we'll just
okay,
park that
okay.
till we finished this bit.
Second nutrient group we'll look at is calorie density, how concentrated the calories are in a food. And in their dry states, grains come in at 300 plus calories per 100 grams. And just remember that number, 300. But if we cook it and we're eating a pasta or a brown rice or a millet or a quinoa, and it's sort of hydrated, cooked in water, the calorie density drops from 300 to 125 kilocalories per 100 grams, which is about the sweet spot for most people to sort of, maintain a steady body weight. And it's about the level recommended by the American Cancer Research Organization and another US cancer body as, being an optimal sort of calorie density for health and weight. Contrast this 125 with meat, which is around 200 plus, much more calorie dense. Or nuts, 600 per 100 grams. Now, I suppose we should compare nuts with a dried grain product, like if it was a nut flour. If it was a grain flour, it'd be 300 plus. Whereas if it was a nut flour, it'd be 600. So replacing grain flours with nut flours is sort of a bit of a recipe for weight gain. The nutrient we've relegated to number 3 is protein. On average, the whole grains have about the right proportion of protein to meet our human protein requirements. Protein requirements of around about 10% of calories. And if you look at grains and you look at nuts and foods and you look at the protein content, the percentage of protein, the protein per calorie, grains are up there pretty much level with nuts. So I propose that grains get an extra place in the food groups as part of the protein group. I'll be waiting for the next guidelines again.
Well, we'd actually rather they didn't have a protein group, wouldn't we?
Yeah. Anyway, everyone would have heard of quinoa, protein. It's a protein. No, it's not. Actually, quinoa sort of is quite a nice sort of balanced sort of proportion of amino acids and things, which sort of gives it higher reputation than it deserves. It's about 14% protein. Wheat's around about 15%. Oats around about 14% protein. So they're all pretty much on a par. Millet and buckwheat probably be fairly similar. Rice is a little bit lower at about 9% of calories from protein, but you still get by on brown rice and vegetables. So that's the protein issue. So whole grains are a good source of protein, perfectly adequate. If you have a meal and the main source of calories is whole grains, you're not going to get protein deficient. Vitamins and minerals. I remember reading in medical school, the Japanese Navy, in the late 1800s, when more and more, when polished rice, white rice, became more widely available with the Industrial Revolution, they all got beriberi, thiamine deficiency. In fact, thiamine deficiency is still quite prevalent in more impoverished parts of the world where people are just eating white rice. Like other nutrients, thiamine's concentrated in the bran, in the outer layer of the grain. So, if you eat brown rice, you'll get the thiamine. Whole grains are moderately high in minerals. including iron. And iron deficiency is the most common nutrient deficiency in Australia.
And that you see even among some plant-based people.
Yeah, we see that among plant-based people, most often affecting women with their increased iron needs, and having a similar prevalence in meat eaters and vegetarians, actually. We attribute this prevalence of iron deficiency to the displacement of moderately high-calorie, high iron content foods like your whole grains with calories that instead come from zero iron foods like olive oil, sugar, or combined with foods that block iron absorption like dairy, or foods like refined grains that have some iron, but they've lost a lot of their iron and other nutrients and minerals. And I hope you understand the concept of displacement. You know, if you eat more of one food, more calories of one food, you eat less calories of something else, unless you're on some sort of permanent weight gain thing.
So to give you an example, we've looked at pasta, and there's 3.9 grams per 100 grams of uncooked pasta
Of
iron, versus in a white wheat pasta, 1 gram. So you think about that, 3.9 grams of, actually it's milligrams, sorry, I put grams on the milligrams of iron versus 1 milligram. And same with zinc. It's more than, the refined grain has less than half the amount of zinc that the whole grain pasta has. And so this is wheat flours as well, would be the same ratio. Fibre, nearly 10 grams of fibre per 100 grams of either flour or a whole grain pasta versus 3.2 grams of fibre. So that's 3 times the fibre in the whole grain version. People are often worried about calcium. So whole wheat pasta has 63 milligrams of calcium and only 18 in the refined grain. Magnesium, 85 milligrams versus 30. So if you always eat the refined version of breads, flours, pastas, you're going to be missing out on a lot of nutrients, but you're getting all the same calories.
So yeah, don't be surprised if you get some, have marginal nutrient intakes, maybe even develop a deficiency of iron. So, even if you sort of said, well, look, I do have some whole grains, but I have some refined grains. Well, the difference is so stark that even if half your grains are refined grains, it's going to make a big difference, because refined grains are seriously nutrient depleted. One last group of nutrients, phytonutrients, technically phytochemicals, are the thousands of substances in food, in whole plant foods that have health supporting sort of positive effects on our sort of metabolism and the way our body runs. And although these phytonutrients are not essential, for life, they're not like the nutrients where if you don't have one thing, you'll eventually die, but they are essential for good health. And when people think of all those phytonutrients, they usually think of, greens and berries. Who would have thought that these beige-looking whole grains were packed with the phytonutrients? Like things like oats are very high in the dietary fibre, the beta-glucan that binds to cholesterol in the gut and is one of the few ways that the body can actually dump excess cholesterol.
On that, I'll just actually refer to the question that's come in, I think, via YouTube about dietary fat. Does it contribute to the elevation of cholesterol? Well, what Malcolm's just said is that dietary fibre, particularly and especially certain types of dietary fibre, are very good for lowering cholesterol. And if you're having a high dietary fat, then you're having less carbohydrate containing fibre.
Yeah, and more specifically, when we eat cholesterol, we can only sort of absorb so much of it per day. But there's saturated fats in the diet, which most animal products have quite a lot of saturated fat. Even the so-called lean protein animal products have quite a lot of saturated fat, and saturated fat makes the liver produce more cholesterol. There's some plant fats as well that are saturated fats, but we'll move on.
Well,
on
just
our,
to wind up answering that question about, does dietary fat contribute to the elevation of it? I mean, for those of you that haven't met us before, Malcolm is a doctor, a GP, and he's, many years worked with people, mainstream medicine as well as, plant-based nutrition. And you see it consistently, people who are struggling to get their cholesterol down, and you recommend that they, even if they're doing a good quality whole food plant-based diet, drop some of those high fat items, and usually the cholesterol goes down.
It seems for some people, even high consumption of nuts, many of which actually have substantial amounts of saturated fat and not all good fats, when they drop those down to in their diet, then often their cholesterol drops down. So I ran into someone I hadn't seen for years, and I was in a swimming group with him, and I said, "Hey, how you going?" I hadn't seen him for years, and he said, Malcolm, I took your advice about not eating meat and dairy, and I thought, did I say that in a swim squat between breaths? He said, yep, and my cholesterol dropped from 6 down to 3.5. So I was very touched by that. There are lots of other phytonutrients and whole grains. We won't go through a list of hundreds. The other one's polyphenols. Whole wheat has more polyphenols per weight than extra virgin olive oil. And if you're measuring it per calorie, it's astronomically more. So there's some polyphenols. I think they're in the brand, so they'll be in the whole grains, but not so much in the refined. And then there's those phytates, which the low carb people say they're anti-nutrients. They interfere with absorption of some nutrients. They do have some effect on nutrient intake, nutrient absorption, but they're also phytonutrients that sort of have some anti-cancer effects and some positive effects on bone health as well. So whole grain consumption, like I guess the bottom line is, what does the science show? Like is it like the low carb and the grain brains, and people would sort of have us think that people have poor health? We don't always see good health stats with people who eat a whole lot of refined grains, refined carbs. It's often in a mixture. It's not only a refined grain. It's not just eating white rice and vegetables. It's often, a processed food that has all this extra, fat and sugar and
ultra processed
ingredients added to it. But when it comes to whole grains, like if you look at the NHI ARP diet and health study, one of the biggest, longest sort of running studies in the US, sort of an observational study. Consumption of whole grains were inversely associated, that is, that cause less of all-cause mortality. That is, you eat more whole grains, there's less chance of dying for your particular age group, or reduced deaths from cancer, reduced cardiovascular disease, reduced diabetes. Okay, low carbers, whole grains don't cause diabetes. They seem to protect against it. Respiratory disease, that's an odd one. Infections and other causes, like just about any major chronic disease group, and death risk seems to be reduced by eating more whole grains. And there's lots of other studies and research that looks at that. And I don't know if there's ever been a study that I don't think you'll find a study that shows that people eat more whole grains and they have worse health. Maybe you find a study where they didn't find anything in that study. Some of the whole grains that we eat and how we might eat them is we cook oats for breakfast. We eat a lot of oats for breakfast. We often eat rice in the evening, and that's brown rice, often with a bit of added red rice or black rice.
Or wild rice.
Wild rice, which is not actually a rice, it's another grain. Yep. We had millet tonight. Millet's actually one of the, there's a whole group of grains, and has sort of actually been one of the leading grains in the world, although not often consumed in Australia. You have corn tortillas or corn on the cob. We have buckwheat. We use buckwheat flour. We sometimes cook little buckwheat grains. We recently discovered sorghum. It was red sorghum, wasn't it? That's quite nice, the sorghum. We should cook that again. For the evening meal, as a sort of base for the evening meal, we're big on our grains, like our whole grains that make up the core of our evening meal.
And our evening meal is also, we cook enough to have as leftovers for lunch. So the grains are in there at lunchtime as well.
Then all we need to do is think of what sort of fancy, vegetable, legume, spicy dish we're going to cook to go with it, and maybe a few steamed veggies on the side. Maybe a few potatoes. But anyway, enough about food. Some purple sweet potatoes tonight to accompany the millet. Wholemeal bread. We get some wholemeal bread. This is a tricky one because in Australia you only have to be 25% wholemeal to have wholemeal on the front. Turn it around. Look at the label on the back. Does the first ingredient have the magic word wholemeal in it? If not, it is less than 50% wholemeal. But at least it's got some wholemeal in it, as the Danish project would say. There's whole wheat pasta. As I said, we find get a nice little wholemeal pasta twists, organic from Coles when it's not out of stock.
When it's there.
Actually,
on the millet, well, I was so excited to see that sort of own brand of Coles started selling millet. I think it was even organic millet, and it was there for weeks and weeks. And I would always buy, a packet or two each week, and then it disappeared. And then the label on the shelf disappeared. So I asked a staff member, and oh yes, it wasn't deleted as yet, but he suggested maybe there was a problem with supply, and I thought, oh no. I was so excited that we could get a good quality millet at our local supermarket.
Yeah, recently Coles and Woolworths have decided to decrease the range of products they have. And we do have some wheat products like
flour, as you mean.
Some flour products. Like neither of us have bad problems with our blood sugar control or anything like that. So we mix whole wheat and buckwheat flour and make pancakes, often the Japanese vegetable pancakes and the like. So sort of to sum up, whole grains are a core food group on a whole foods plant-based diet, along with legumes, vegetables, and fruit. Whole grains have only ever been associated with less chronic disease and better health in all the studies that have looked at it. So enjoy them every day. Try a few different grains for variety. Choose whole grains over refined grains, whenever possible. And enjoy them as a base for your favorite cuisine.
So that's all we wanted to say on whole grains. Anyone have any questions? Please pop them in the comments or chat, whatever you want to call it, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. We've answered the question about, we've got one on thoughts on K1 and K2 vitamins and their sources.
There's leafy green vegetables in particular are very high in vitamin K, vitamin K1, which is a plant form of vitamin K. The animal forms vitamin K2. And your gut microbiome can turn some of that, we had a lot of spinach in our dish tonight, and it would turn some of that vitamin K1 to K2. But also note that we're animals too. And so our bodies can make vitamin K2 out of vitamin K1. So there have been some studies of vitamin K2 and heart disease because, people often take vitamin K2 to reduce heart risk. It doesn't seem to work. But eat your green leafy vegetables and you'll get ample vitamin K.
Thanks for that question, Sam. If anyone else has questions, pop them in. Is there anything else that we want to talk about before we sign off? We've got
just whole grains.
I think when we did our last live stream, which has already been deleted from Facebook, it was right at the end of March, but it's on our YouTube channel. We That was just before we did that on olive oil, and it was just before the big debate that Forks Over Knives had about olive oil. And yes, it's caused quite a bit of a stir. But for those of you that missed that live stream, we're still very firmly recommending that you avoid added oils, even olive oil. And of course, that's relevant to tonight's topic, because if you're consuming oil, you're not getting the vitamins and minerals that.
Yeah, if you have 1 tablespoon of olive oil, 160 calories, that's how much rice would it be? 2/3 of a cup? Yeah, that would be equivalent to the calories from 2/3 of a cup of brown rice, where you'd get all those nutrients and fibre.
I mean, in terms of cooked cup of rice.
Cooked cup of rice,
would have, and many more nutrients than there's almost none.
You know, and we don't think the evidence is there for claiming that, you know, Evo is sort of heart protective. We regard it as, at best, having enough good things in it to offset some of its own sort of artery damaging effect. But you know what? Even if extra virgin special high polyphenol olive oil had some mild heart protective effect, it pales in insignificance compared to things like leafy green vegetables.
I've just remembered why I was mentioning the oil was that since that last live stream, the Forks Over Knives, you know, what do you want to call them, business, made an announcement that they were going to start having oil as options in some of their recipes. They've got many hundreds of recipes available on their website, as well as you can have them buy an app. And that really is... that's I think that's caused some issues. And one of them, they had 2 reasons for recommending it. One of them, which is at face value a very valid reason, they didn't want to make it sound too hard. People often say, oh, you know, it's hard enough for people who are new to it to drop the animal products, you know, why make it too hard? But on that count, what we want people to understand is which foods are healthy and which foods are not. And it's like, you know, you decide how much you're going to, you know, if you're interested in being whole food plant-based, as to how whole food plant-based you are. That's your decision. But we don't want to kid you and say, oh, yeah, add a few tablespoons of olive oil. That's just fine. Because that will impact your iron intake, your protein intake, your calcium intake, if you do have a few tablespoons of oil every day.
And you know, if you're going to have your recipes and say, oh, look, it's an option to use some olive oil, we know it's super high in calories and got hardly any nutrients, and, you know, not going to do anything all that positive, but hey, you know, make it easier for you. Well, maybe they could put, you know, refined grains in there. It's like, you know, the low in fibre, not good for your microbiome, blah, blah, lacking nutrients. You might get iron deficient. But hey, we want to make it easier for you. Yeah, we'd rather not see that. I mean, you know, always take the approach, like when we're at our immersion event, it's like people, you know, our participants, it's like, it's up to you what you do when you get home. You know, if you're still going to eat some, you know, fish or you know, refined grains, or use some oil or something, or be a little bit over generous with the salt, that's up to you. And you know, we'd be supportive in what you choose to do, but we think it's important to give people the basic pattern and tell them the truth about, you know, which foods are sort of going to be best for improving their health, and not patronize people, you know, let people decide themselves. Like, we feel like we don't need to give people any help with eating off plan. I think most people can, a lot of people can do that quite well without our help. We just need to sort of help to guide them on, you know, what would I eat if I was sort of trying to, you know, be highly adherent to have a very healthy plant-based diet.
Oh, and you mentioned the immersion. We have our 7-day immersion at the end of October, and we're now taking registrations for that. We just take a deposit at this point, with full payment due a month prior. And I'll put into the comments on both YouTube and Facebook what the link is for the immersion. But more closer event that we've got going, we're collaborating again with Anita Ricky from Digger's Veggie Kitchen in Anglesey, and we're running a weekend retreat in Queenscliff at the end of June. And so if that's something, so it's Queenscliff in Victoria, if you're not sort of thinking, if you can't find the time to do a 7-day immersion, maybe have a look at our weekend retreat. It's a lot of focus on the cooking, which Anita does. She does cooking workshops, so you get to do hands-on.
We do some presentation and talking and Q&A, but she doesn't let us talk too much. It's very much about the cooking workshops and the cooking demonstrations and the food.
And the food, which is whole food, plant-based. Okay, so if we don't have any other questions, I think we'll sign off for tonight, and until our next live stream, which we'll probably do in about a month's time. Good night, and thanks for watching.
Good night.
Good night.